Hello everybody. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about something that's kind of been on my mind for the past couple of months, especially with a lot of the talk around lengthened partials in the community. It's kind of been talked about to the point where it's like I'm tired of hearing it. I don't really care about it anymore. But the thing is, I do still care about applications of range of motion, and I think that the average person, even the person who's like kind of trying to educate themselves on these things, probably isn't fully aware of like the implications and applications of different ranges of motion for their particular training goals. So today we're going to be talking about the applications of range of motion and extended versus partial ranges of motion for both size and for strength. So the very first thing that you got to understand is range of motion is kind of an arbitrary like quality that we assign to different exercises. This is because range of motion for different exercises is essentially socially determined. There's no like law of physics or metaphysical reason why a bench press is full range of motion only when it starts with locked out elbows at the top and goes down to touch your chest and reverses. This is something we determine socially as lifters, and for that reason it's incredibly malleable. What is a full range of motion for one person is not necessarily a full range of motion for another person, and what looks like a partial range of motion for one exercise could be a full range of motion for another exercise entirely. So this video is not going to discuss what counts as a rep. That's not really the interesting thing. And it kind of lends itself to very absolutist views where you either end up in the super giga lengthened partials count, that's the only part that matters, the stretch position, bro, versus, you know, every rep has to be perfectly locked out and paused there and reversed and paused at the bottom, and both of those are very uninteresting to me. So with this in mind, right, we need to understand what defines a partial and what defines an extended range of motion, because these are terms which are relative to what we consider a full range of motion. So in order to determine what those mean, you first need to pick a main lift. So to use the example of a bench press, when we have a main lift that is the bench press, we have the full range of motion for a bench press, which is locked elbows, touch the chest, lock elbows again. Now, with that full range in mind, we can talk about what is an extended range of motion in the context of the bench press and what is a partial range of motion in the context of a bench press. So a floor press or a pin press where the elbows come only to 90 degrees or parallel with the floor is a partial range of motion for the bench press. But for their own exercises, they are a full range of motion. These are two separate variables. So there is the variable of the exercise itself, and that is there's the other variable, which is how it relates to whatever exercise it is being sort of conjoined with in our mind. So same thing sort of applies to the extreme ranges of motion. If we're doing something like a super deep dumbbell press where we're arching our chest as hard as we can and we're actively rowing the dumbbells further down, that is going to be an extended range of motion because it goes past the range of motion compared to our main lift, which is the bench press. So we need to get this out of the way because it's been annoying the hell out of me, right? There are a lot of people who talk about these types of things but have no idea what they actually mean. It is currently in vogue to discuss ad nauseum the merits of these extended ranges of motion and increasingly lengthened partials, which is another group of terms often closely related, notably separate in their meanings. Extended ranges of motion, as we already talked about, are describing performing lifts in such a way that a particular muscle can further lengthen and stretch while still receiving tension. So that's things like deficit push-ups with a full range of motion, or deficit stiff-legged deadlifts with a full range of motion. Lengthened partials, however, they describe a different thing entirely, and it has nothing to do with extended ranges of motion. Lengthened partials, they describe performing a lift such that the lockout portion of the lift is avoided. This is thought to produce additional stimulus by spending more time in most of the time, more difficult part of the range of motion. This is related to strength curves, which is another thing that people really don't understand, and is also part of the discussion with lengthened partials and extended ranges of motion, but is very poorly understood by the general population who tries to talk about it. So if you understand the distinction between lengthened partials and extended ranges of motion, you can understand that deficit push-ups and stiff-leg deadlifts are not lengthened partials inherently, and that you can actually do short range of motion lifts with lengthened partials. So you can do a floor press with a lengthened partial. You can do a pin squat or a rack pull with partials, lengthened partials, no less. So that's pretty much all the housekeeping done. And we can actually start to talk about the main subject, which is the actual applications for both size and strength of different ranges of motion. So the relationship between size and reduced ranges of motion has been especially muddled by growing science-based channels and science-based talking points, especially Renaissance periodization, which, keep in mind, Renaissance periodization style training definitely has its place. It's super valuable. I think a lot of people really benefit by understanding Renaissance style training, and I personally use a lot of the thinking and thought processes that they use in my own stuff. But although these are like large cultural shifts and changes that have had largely a good effect on the lifting community online, it does come with downsides. And one of those downsides is the rejection of traditional or cross-disciplinary training knowledge, particularly from powerlifting, strongman, and related strength sports in the context of hypertrophy. Now, let's be frank. Dr. Mike Isertel would likely never recommend doing a close grip pin press to build bigger triceps. One can imagine him arguing that the stimulus to fatigue ratio is unfavorable, that the time investment per session is not worth it because it requires you to load up extra weight, or that the range of motion is somehow much less relevant for the triceps. However, nerd emoji. However, experienced lifters ranging from certain bodybuilders, John Meadows comes to mind, to powerlifters, John Meadows' favorite associate, Dave Tate, and also Mark Bell, people like that, strongmen, Joe Satmary, Brian Alzeru, all are people who I have seen to recommend this movement, or at least similar movements, as a way of expressly building up arm size. One might wonder why that is, if what the hypothetical strawman version of Dr. Mike that I presented earlier says, if what he says is true. So what he says is not untrue. I think that those points that I brought up earlier on the side of the more Renaissance style training are absolutely valid as reasons why you would not want to do a close grip pin press for triceps, or substitute your favorite partial movement for muscle growth there. But it does notably leave out a major point about such an exercise. It can and will do what you want it to do if you apply it correctly. And there are several other legitimate reasons. Oh, pardon. There are several legitimate reasons to not include close grip pin presses and similar reduced range of motion movements if your goal is hypertrophy. However, that should not necessarily exclude them from your toolbox. Ultimately, the primary factor in stimulation of hypertrophy is the accumulation of mechanical tension and activating of high threshold motor units in the muscle. And as long as the range of motion does not become so reduced and the stimulus to fatigue ratio becomes so bad that we are still able to accrue a sufficient stimulus to elicit growth, partial ranges of motion can still be incredibly useful in contributing to size gains. How many people have you seen that squat to parallel, like powerlifting parallel, that still have pretty sizable legs? The answer is, you've probably seen quite a few of them, and I don't think that's a mistake. Now, maybe they do other leg bodybuilding work, leg extensions, leg presses, hack squats, but chances are if they're squatting only to parallel anyway, and they're taking their time to squat, they're going to be investing some reasonable amount of their weekly quad training volume into the squat. And if that is the case, and they have fairly large quads, it is not unreasonable to suggest that they built their quads through application of a partial range of motion squat. So keep in mind that those things that the hypothetical Dr. Mike said are not untrue. When including reduced range of motion lifts, you should, like any other lift, consider the stimulus to fatigue and the stimulus to time ratios, but you should also consider if including such a lift could have utility to some other goal. Not everyone is a pure hypertrophy enthusiast. Some people have strength goals, whether that be street lifting, powerlifting, strongman, whatever, odd lifting, I don't care. The point is, if that is the case, that it applies to some other goal, or you just find it fun enough and you think it's worth getting similar gains out of more work, don't sleep on that second reason. Enjoying your training will often get you better results than doing what is optimal for long portions of your training career. Then it is worth including or thinking about including these so-called unoptimal movements. One is reminded of Alex Leonidas during his, I wasn't lifting at the time, so this all exists in the past to me as a history, but his rack pull mania, right? The endorsement of the above the knee rack pulls as an upper trap builder. Such a thing would definitely not be endorsed under the worldview, which demands that we always do what is optimal on paper for our goals. Yet the above the knee rack pulls today, by a lot of people's metrics, are widely regarded as a tremendous upper trap builder. And I think it's funny how that is. So yeah, I'm not really gonna cover the extended ranges of motion for size. I think that's been a horse that's been beaten on for a long time now. And it's been talked about so much elsewhere that I don't really have anything unique to add to the topic, other than the fact that the general training population cannot, on average, fathom the difference between training a muscle in a lengthened position and training a muscle with a lengthened biased strength curve. If you can understand the difference between those two things, it will help your training so much. You'll understand it so much better. If you cannot distinguish those two things, you're going to make misinformed decisions about things that would otherwise not impede you. Like if you're, it's kind of like the bell curve of like the stupid guy says one thing, and then the guy in the middle who like kind of understands it, he says something like stupid, and then the advanced guy says the same thing as the stupid guy. It's kind of like that. So if you kind of know, that's worse than actually knowing or not knowing at all. So you really need to take your own time, understand the difference between lengthened and shortened biased or mid-ranged biased strength curves and shortened and lengthened and mid-range muscle positions. Two separate things. So now we're going to move on to the discussion of range of motion as it relates to strength training. So as I alluded to earlier, reduced ranges of motion are commonly cited in strength training circles as surefire ways to increase positional strength for particular lifts. So that's things like block pulls for the sumo deadlift, pin presses for bench and overhead, and box or pin squats, and high squats and Anderson squats, and all of that for the squat pattern. Several others, ranging from curls and triceps extensions, I've also seen done in partial ranges of motion for strength. And it's even how some people train their abs. I find that to be ridiculous, but I have seen it. Those are pretty much uncontroversial, most of them at least, due to their prevalence in those circles, and thus, again, pretty uninteresting to me. Though I will make note that a lot of these variations are dead stop, or otherwise break up the eccentric concentric chain. That's a fancy term for saying your muscles lose tightness at the bottom of the lift, and they need to contract really hard in order to get the lift moving. This is a benefit basically because it teaches you how to maximally contract those muscles from a dead stop position. It's like turning every lift into a bit of a deadlift. As a result, you can build a lot of dead stop starting power with these lifts, and for that I do commend them. I will also champion them as being arguably more specific to their respective main lifts, and thus probably also more sport specific in many contexts. So what's really interesting to me are the underutilized applications in strength training of extended range of motion lifts outside the bounds of sport-specific application, just building general strength and building the capacities which have good carryover to strength. So I myself have experienced, and several others in the online fitness space have experienced, that using extended range of motion lifts in a strength training context, it works really, really well. I personally find it works better for me than the partial ranges of motion. So how many times have you heard adding dips to my program really blew up my bench, or like otherwise stuff like stiff-legged deadlifts really help my conventional? Those reports aren't accidents. They actually speak to something mechanically very interesting going on in our lifting, which is not immediately obvious to some people. So by utilizing extended range of motion lifts, we ask that the body build a surplus of strength and coordination and neural drive in ranges of motion which exceed the main lift. This often comes with the benefits of exposing our muscles to more stretch and mechanical tension, which leads to more hypertrophy, which definitely contributes to strength. And that same mechanical tension, coordination, and neural drive also helps generate more capacity for strength as a result. A lot of these also have the benefit of, because they're extended ranges of motion and we're building surplus strength and coordination in those extended ranges, it's kind of like, the term is, some people call it bulletproofing. Let's just say it can help increase injury resistance, at least acute injury resistance. So the effect of utilizing these extended ranges of motion in a strength training context is threefold. So the additional range of motion almost always involves creating less systemic fatigue on account of using the reduced loads that it requires, while keeping local muscular stimulus high, essentially presenting a better stimulus to fatigue ratio. We build additional muscle tissue, which can be leveraged in the main lift to put more horsepower behind our engine. And this is the most interesting part for our discussion, in my opinion. Practicing extended ranges of motion for strength training essentially turn the main lift into a partial lift. That, I think, is really the cool thing here. The first time I heard of this phenomenon and started contemplating the underlying principle of it was listening to Paris Butler, Bald Omni-Man, and how he organized his bench training a couple years back. He said he did his primary day, he would have a self-limiting variation, famously his beloved Larson press, and on his secondary day he would have some lower volume of the comp bench variation, or something closer to the comp bench variation, to maintain the skill of the comp bench. The Larson press, although I have described my gripes with it in the past, is still a very good lift. It extends the range of motion, if only marginally, and reduces the demands of the lower body for the bench press. Butler described it as a lift which he used in his for pressing muscle hypertrophy, and is the main lift he used to drive up strength in his bench training during that time. Very similar case comes from Sam Sheether, who attributes in part his bench press prowess to his ability and dedication in the past to horsing heavy dumbbell bench through an extended range of motion. Again, citing hypertrophy benefits, but still underscoring the role that it played in his general development as a bench presser. Also coming to mind, kind of more off the top of my head, is Ed Cohen. Ed Cohen, very famous powerlifter, if you don't know, often considered one of the greatest or the greatest powerlifter of all time. He spent pretty much all of his off season doing high bar squats instead of the competition specific low bar squat. And that was in part for reducing fatigue. So he was using less weight, of course, and it beat up his elbows, wrists, shoulders less, beat up his back less because he's not as bent over. But it also came with the additional hypertrophy benefit that comes from shoving your knees more forward and getting your quads more and more involved in the movement. So that he found helped a lot of the time when he would transition back to his low bar squat. The self-limiting variation of the high bar squat would have a lot of carryover. So the broader narrative I'm trying to paint here about the relationship between extended ranges of motion and lifting with the goal of strength is an understanding that extended range of motion lifts make particularly useful self-limiting variations from a general developmental perspective, and should thus be near the top of your list whenever you're considering a self-limiting variation for that purpose. So in closing, today we opened by discussing the nuances of what makes a full range of motion and what constitutes extended and partial ranges deriving from that, and we talked briefly about the difference between lengthened, partials, and extended range of motion lifting. We followed that up with a discussion about the efficacy of partial or reduced range of motion lifts in a hypertrophy context and the upsides and downsides therein. And we finished up with a brief discussion about some examples of the applications of extended range of motion lifts relative to the main lift in a general strength context and the developmental benefits of such self-limiting variations. So thank you all for watching. I'd love to hear your thoughts about this topic and its many particular applications in the comments. So please take care, train hard, and have a great day.